The morning Alma Merritt climbed down from the livery wagon and set her boots on the red dust of Harlan Creek, Texas. Every man within 50 yards stopped what he was doing and stared, and not a single one of them had the decency to look away. It was the spring of 1878, and Harlan Creek was the kind of town that had grown faster than it had grown wise. A cattle town sitting fat and loud on the edge of the Edwards Plateau, where the grass ran long and the water ran short and men made fortunes or lost their souls, sometimes in the same week. The main street was wide enough for 2 wagons to pass without brushing wheels, lined with a hardware store, a dry goods shop, a barbershop that doubled as a dentist's office, a saloon called the Red Mare, and a land office that had seen more arguments than the courthouse 3 counties over. Dust lived in Harlan Creek the way relatives live in a small house, permanently, intrusively, and with no intention of leaving. Alma was 26 years old, and she wore her dark hair pinned under a wide-brimmed hat that had belonged to her father. She carried a leather satchel over one shoulder and a rolled deed in her right hand, and she walked like a woman who had already decided how things were going to go. She was not beautiful in the soft, ornamental way that men in that town appreciated. She was striking cheekbones carved sharp, brown eyes steady and direct, a mouth that pressed into a flat line when she was thinking and curved wide, and sudden when something surprised her into laughter. She had been in neither a laughing nor a soft mood since leaving San Antonio, and she did not intend to start now. Her father, Thomas Merritt, had died 4 months before from a fever that had come on fast and taken him faster. He had left her the deed to the Merritt Ranch, 460 acres of grassland with a creek-fed water source, a decent house in need of repair, 2 small outbuildings, and a cattle pen that her father had been proud of. He had also left her a small sum of money that had barely covered his burial and her journey north. Thomas Merritt had been a stubborn man with a good heart, and he had raised Alma alone after her mother passed when Alma was 9. He had taught her to read, to keep accounts, to ride, and to evaluate cattle by eye before she was 14. He had also taught her, by way of his own example, that pride and competence were the same thing, and that anyone who told her otherwise was simply trying to keep her manageable. She had heard plenty of that on the way to Harlan Creek. The land agent in San Antonio had squinted at her deed and suggested she might want to sell. A rancher on the road north had told her the land was too much for a woman alone. The livery driver who had carried her the last 12 miles had said, not unkindly but not helpfully either, that she might want to find a husband quick before the neighboring ranches decided her water rights were up for discussion. Alma had thanked each of them politely and then done exactly what she had already planned to do. She walked to the land office first, had the deed registered in her name, Alma Grace Merritt, sole heir, and then walked to the general store to purchase the supplies she needed for the first 2 weeks alone on the property. The storekeeper, a round-faced man named Dobbins with a kind disposition and an unfortunate tendency to underestimate people, had glanced at her list and then at her and said, "You sure you know what all this is for, miss?" She had looked at him evenly. "I know what a fence post brace is, Mr. Dobbins. I also know what a fair price for one is. Would you like to continue, or shall we start over?" Dobbins had turned a remarkable shade of pink, and they had gotten along fine after that. It was outside the general store, loading her supplies into the small wagon she had arranged to borrow, that she first saw Aaron Quinn. He came around the corner of the livery stable across the street, with a length of rope in one hand and a bucket of water in the other, moving in that unhurried, deliberate way that some men develop when they have spent years working with animals that are twice their size and half as patient. He was 30 years old, though he looked younger in the face and older in the eyes, a thing that happened to men who had spent their 20s out of doors in difficult country. He was lean in the way that comes from work rather than shortage, with wide shoulders and hands that were rough and capable. His hat was dark with sweat around the band, and he had a 3-day beard and the kind of quiet expression that was hard to read from a distance. He did not stare at Alma the way the others had. He glanced at her once, noted her, and went back to what he was doing. That, more than anything else about him, was what she remembered. She did not introduce herself. She loaded her wagon, said goodbye to Dobbins, and drove out to the Merritt property 6 miles east of town. The house was worse than she had expected. Her father had been sick longer than he had let on in his letters, and the last year's neglect showed in the sagging porch rail, the broken shutter, the dry rot along the base of the south-facing wall. The cattle pen was empty. Her father's small herd had been sold to cover debts she had not known he had. But the structure itself was sound, built from good cedar posts set deep, with a water trough and a loading chute that had been maintained even when other things had not. Alma stood in the doorway of the house for a long time, looking at the work that waited for her, and she felt the full weight of what she had taken on pressed down across her shoulders. Then she took a breath, walked inside, and started making a list. She worked the first week alone. She repaired the porch rail, rehung the shutter, hauled water, and began the process of understanding exactly what she owned and what condition it was in. She killed a rattlesnake behind the outhouse on the 3rd day and felt obscurely satisfied about it. She ate simply and slept hard and woke before dawn and worked until dark. On the 8th day, she drove back into Harlan Creek for more nails and to inquire about purchasing cattle. She had done the arithmetic carefully in her father's old account book. She could afford a small starter herd, nothing more, and she would need to run the ranch on tight margins for at least 2 years before it began to pay. It was not a comfortable situation, but it was a solvable one, and solvable was enough. It was at the stockyards on the east end of town that she encountered the first real obstacle. The stockyard was run by a man named Harlan Voss, no relation to the town's founder, who was thick-necked and red-faced, and had the look of a man who had never been told no by anyone who mattered to him. He was standing at the gate when Alma arrived, talking to 2 other men, and he had turned to her with the particular expression she had come to recognize, the one that meant a man was deciding how much trouble he wanted to take before dismissing her. "I'm Alma Merritt," she said. "I own the Merritt property east of town. I'm looking to purchase a small head of cattle to start a breeding stock." Voss had looked at her, then at the rolled deed she carried, then back at her. "Merritt's girl," he said. "Heard Tom left the place to you. He said it the way someone says a thing they find mildly absurd. He did. I've registered the deed. I'm prepared to pay fair market price for good stock." "Well now," Voss said, and he scratched the back of his neck in a way that was meant to look thoughtful and only looked condescending. "The thing is, Miss Merritt, I'm not sure I can do that. The pen's got some animals in it right now that have been promised to other buyers, and I'm running low on—" "What stock do you have available?" she said. He named a figure that was 30% above fair market price, and then watched her with the polite expectation that she would not know the difference. She named the fair market price back to him without blinking. A silence settled between them that was not comfortable for either of them, but considerably less comfortable for Voss, who had not expected arithmetic. "Tell you what," Voss said, with a smile that did not reach his eyes. "I'll think on it and you come back." "I'll come back tomorrow," Alma said, "and I'll expect the price I named." She turned and walked toward the gate, and that was when she saw Aaron Quinn again. He was on the other side of the fence, working with a pair of horses in the adjacent corral, but he had gone still in that way she would come to recognize, not watching exactly, but aware, the way an experienced man in a tense situation goes quiet without going absent. He did not look at her with pity or amusement. He simply looked at her the way someone looks at a person they are paying honest attention to. Alma met his eyes for exactly 1 second and then walked on. She came back the next day, and the day after. Each time Voss found a new reason to delay or inflate the price, and each time Alma countered him with specific, accurate knowledge that clearly unsettled him. On the 3rd visit, 2 of the men who had been standing with Voss that first day were there again, and one of them made a remark under his breath that Alma chose not to acknowledge, because acknowledging it would have required either backing down or creating a scene, and she was not in a position to afford either outcome. She drove home that evening with her jaw set and her hands tight on the reins, and she sat on her repaired porch in the late red light and thought about what her father would have done. Thomas Merritt had not been a man who backed down from unfair treatment, but he had also not been a man who created enemies he did not need. He had believed that patience and preparation could move most obstacles, and that the ones it couldn't were the ones worth knowing, because they told you exactly who you were dealing with. She went back to the stockyards on the fourth day with her deed, her account book, and a letter from the land office confirming the registration of the Merritt property in her name. She walked to the gate and found it was Aaron Quinn standing there. "Voss is out," Quinn said. He had a voice that was unhurried and a little low, and he said the words simply, not as a dismissal and not as an apology. "I'm not leaving until I've arranged a purchase," Alma said. "Wasn't suggesting you should." He opened the gate. "Come in. I can show you what's available." She followed him into the yard. He walked her through the available stock with a calm, practical assessment that told her immediately he knew what he was talking about, pointing out the condition of each animal, noting which ones had come off poor grass and would need time to recover, which ones were sound investments. He didn't talk down to her and he didn't try to talk around her, and after about 10 minutes of this, Alma said, "You know I'm going to ask you what the actual price should be." "I know," he said. He named a number. It was almost exactly what she had calculated. She looked at him for a moment. "Why are you doing this?" He seemed to consider the question genuinely before answering. "Because Voss has been playing games with you, and the only reason he's been playing games with you is that he thinks he can. He's wrong, but that won't stop him from trying again unless you come back with a fair transaction on record. And you work for him. I work for the stockyards. There's a difference most days." She thought about this. "You have a name, Aaron Quinn." "I know that name," she said, and she did. Dobbins at the general store had mentioned him when she'd been asking about cattle. "Quinn knows good stock," he'd said. "Quiet fellow, but honest." "My father talked about your father's herd," Quinn said. "Said it was some of the best managed cattle in the county before he stopped." "Before he got sick," Alma finished for him. Quinn nodded, and there was something in his expression, not pity. She was sure of that, but something more careful and more respectful than pity. They settled on a small purchase, 14 head of cattle, a mix of cows and 2 bulls at a fair price, documented and signed before Voss came back. When Voss returned and found the paperwork already done, his face went through several unpleasant colors, but there was nothing for him to say. The transaction was clean and complete. Alma drove her new cattle home that afternoon with Quinn riding alongside to help manage the herd on the road, because 14 cattle and 1 woman and 1 wagon was a practical challenge, and he had offered, and she had said yes without making more of it than it was. They talked on the road the way people talk when they are working together toward a practical goal, about the land, the grass quality east of town, the water situation, the neighbors. Quinn told her that the rancher to her north, a man named Cowhand, had been grazing his cattle on the edge of Merritt land for the past year, using the creek access that was legally hers. "He'll push back when you fence it," Quinn said. "I know," Alma said. "Let him." Quinn glanced at her from under the brim of his hat. There was something in that glance that she would not have been able to name yet, but she felt it, a kind of attention that was different from the attention she had been receiving since she arrived in Harlan Creek. The others looked at her as a problem to be managed. Quinn looked at her as a person to be understood. She put the cattle in the pen, thanked him, and watched him ride back toward town. Then she stood at the fence and looked at her small herd in the late afternoon light and felt something shift inside her chest. Not happiness exactly, but the particular satisfaction of a thing begun. The weeks that followed were hard in the way that honest work is hard, which is to say they were not cruel but they were unrelenting. Alma fenced the creek boundary at the north end of her property, and Cowhand came down the road to object with 2 of his ranch hands behind him, and she stood at her fence with her deed in her hand, and told him that she had the land office documentation to support every inch of that fence line, and that she was happy to let a judge confirm it if he felt strongly. Calhoun was not a cruel man, just an opportunistic one, and when it became clear that she was not going to back down and that the documentation was airtight, he grumbled and turned his horses around, and that was the last she heard from him directly. She saw Quinn twice more in that month, once when she came to the stockyards to ask about hay prices, and once by coincidence at the general store. Both times they spoke briefly and practically, and both times she noticed that the conversation felt different from the conversations she had with other people in town, easier, less guarded, as if they were both operating by the same implicit rules. She also noticed, and tried not to notice, that he was thoughtful in a way that was unusual. When she had mentioned, in passing, that the broken fence post at the south end of her property was giving her trouble, he had not offered to fix it. He had told her where in Harlan Creek to buy the right diameter post for that kind of soil, and which brace style would hold best against the wind direction she described. The distinction mattered to her more than she would have admitted out loud. It was the end of May when the real trouble began. Harlan Voss had not forgotten being outmaneuvered on the cattle sale, and men like Voss had long memories and small tolerances. He had started talking around town, nothing specific enough to be actionable, but the kind of ambient noise that builds into a reputation problem if left unchecked. He told people she was inexperienced, that the land would fail under her management, that she'd be selling before the year was out. He implied to people who enjoyed implying things that a woman alone on 40-plus acres was something to be cautious about, as if solitude itself were a moral failing. Alma heard about it from Dobbins, who told her with the apologetic discomfort of a man who has information he wishes he didn't. She sat with it for a day before deciding what to do. What she decided was to go back to the stockyards. Not to buy anything, not to transact, to be seen managing her cattle in the pen, evaluating her animals, working. Because the thing that would defeat Voss's talk was not argument but evidence, and the evidence was her continued, competent, unhurried presence in the business of the town. She drove to the stockyards on a Wednesday morning when the yard was busiest, tied her wagon, walked through the gate, and spent 2 hours working alongside the stock, checking her own animals from the earlier purchase who were being temporarily held in the public pen before the second transport to her property. She worked quietly and efficiently, and she let people see her doing it. She was checking the condition of a young cow near the back of the pen when the animal spooked. A dog had gotten loose near the far fence and set off a chain reaction of movement that was sudden and loud and disorienting. The cow swung hard and fast, and before Alma could step back, she was in the middle of a small surge of moving bodies, penned in on 3 sides by half-ton animals that did not mean her harm but were also not thinking clearly. She did not panic. She had grown up around cattle. But she was in a genuinely precarious position, pinned against the fence with 2 animals pushing toward her, and the space to move was closing. And then she was aware of Aaron Quinn on her left, not rushing, not shouting, not drawing attention to the situation in a way that would further agitate the animals. He had moved into the pen from the gate and positioned himself 3 feet to her left, putting his body between her and the larger of the 2 pressing animals, using a low, steady pressure and a calm, practiced movement to redirect the cow without escalating. He did not touch Alma. He did not tell her to move. He simply placed himself in the space she needed, standing steady where she could step to if she needed to, and she did 1 sidestep to the left and then clear, and the animals settled, and the moment was over in less than 30 seconds. She stood outside the fence, breathing normally, and looked at him. He said nothing. He did not make a performance of having helped. He simply nodded once, brushed dust from his sleeve, and turned back to what he had been doing. Which was the moment Alma Merritt realized that Aaron Quinn was the most unusual man she had ever met. She did not say anything either, and that silence between them had a texture to it that was different from avoidance. It was the silence of two people who understood each other without having to narrate the understanding. She drove home with her cattle that afternoon and sat on the porch after supper and thought about him for longer than she intended. June arrived hot and fast, and with it came the kind of weather that makes everything harder. The water in the creek dropped, the grass yellowed at the tips, and the cattle needed more management to stay in good condition. Alma worked from before dawn until after dark, and she was tired in a way that was bone-deep but not despairing. The ranch was functioning. The cattle were doing well. The fences held. She began going to town once a week for supplies, and she began to realize, without meaning to, that the day she went was Wednesday, and on Wednesdays Aaron Quinn was at the stockyards. They fell into a habit that was not quite friendship and not yet anything else, a standing conversation that happened whenever she came through the stockyard gate, starting always with something practical and ending, gradually, on things less practical. He told her about the horse he was training, a quarter-horse mare with a stubborn streak and an exceptional turn of speed. She told him about the fence repairs she had done and the way the second bull was already improving the herd's temperament. He asked good questions. She noticed that he was someone who listened completely, not just waiting for his turn to speak. She learned things about him piecemeal, the way you learn things about people when neither of you is trying to present yourselves. He had grown up in New Mexico, the second of 4 children. His father had been a horse trader, his mother a school teacher. He had come to Harlan Creek 3 years ago, following a job that had turned into a different kind of life than he'd planned. He had an older sister in Santa Fe who wrote letters that he carried in his shirt pocket until they fell apart. "You never married?" she asked him one Wednesday, more directly than she had intended. He looked at her with that steady look that she had decided meant he was being careful with a thing he cared about. "No," he said. "There was a woman in New Mexico a few years back. We thought about it. It didn't work out." "Why not?" "She wanted a different life than the one I was living." That was fair of her. Was it painful? He thought about this. It was at the time. It doesn't feel like a wound anymore. It feels like information. She thought about that for a long time after she left. July arrived, and with it the quarterly cattle auction that Harlan Creek held every summer, a significant event for every ranching operation in the county, where buyers and sellers came from as far as 40 miles. It was also where Voss held the most influence, since he ran the stockyards and had relationships with most of the major buyers. Alma had no cattle to sell at this point. Her herd was too young and too small. But she had attended her father's auctions as a child, and she knew the importance of being present, of being seen and known, and taken seriously by the buyers who would be back next season, when she would have animals ready to sell. She wore her best dress, practical dark blue wool, clean and pressed, and she wore her father's hat, and she walked into the auction grounds with her account book and her deed and her knowledge of fair market pricing. And she stood where she meant to stand, and she did not excuse herself from any conversation she was dragged into, and she did not let any man talk over her without returning to her point after he was done. She was by the water trough, talking to a cattle buyer from Austin named Perrin who had turned out to be more reasonable than she'd expected, when Voss materialized on her left with 2 men she didn't know and the particular energy of someone who has had time to plan something. "Miss Merritt," Voss said with false warmth, "glad to see you. Been hearing interesting things about that herd of yours." "Then you've been hearing good things," she said. "They're in excellent condition." He turned to Perrin. "Tom Merritt's girl," he said, as if explaining something about her. "Trying to run the family place on her own. We've all been very worried about her." The "we" was meant to encompass everyone, to make her a subject of collective concern rather than a person in a conversation. She had heard the tactic before. "I appreciate the concern," she said, "though I imagine it's been hard to find things to worry about since the ranch is running well and I've had no difficulties that weren't manufactured for me." Perrin made a sound that was almost a laugh and tried to turn it into a cough. Voss's face tightened. "Now, I just mean that some of the established ranchers in the area have experience you might benefit from. I have the experience I need, Alma said. What I don't have is any patience for conversations that are designed to make me feel like I should have less confidence in my own abilities than I've earned. If you'll excuse me. She turned back to Perrin and continued the conversation, and Voss stood there for 2 uncomfortable seconds before withdrawing with whatever dignity he could collect. She was aware, across the crowd, of Aaron Quinn watching. He came to find her later, when the auction was winding down and most people were in loose groups talking. He came with 2 cups of coffee from the stand near the gate, handed her one without asking if she wanted it, and stood beside her looking out at the cattle in the pen. "That was something," he said. "It needed saying." "It did." A pause. "He's going to be meaner about it now." "I know. But I was going to choose between backing down and staying standing, and I'd rather deal with him angry than deal with myself if I'd let it go." Quinn turned to look at her, and there was something in his expression that was new, not the careful, neutral attention she had learned to read, but something warmer and more open, and she felt it land somewhere in her chest and stay there. "Your father raised you well," he said. It was a simple thing to say. It made her eyes go bright with something she had been keeping carefully locked up since Thomas Merritt died, and she looked away at the cattle pen and took a breath and steadied herself. "He did," she said. They stood there with their coffee in the late afternoon heat, not talking, and it was one of the most comfortable silences Alma had experienced in recent memory. He walked her to her wagon when she was ready to go. She climbed up onto the seat and gathered the reins, and she looked down at him standing in the dust of the auction yard with the last light going gold behind him, and she thought, quite clearly, that she was in serious trouble. She said, "Same time next Wednesday." He looked up at her with a small, specific smile that she had not seen from him before. "I'll be there," he said. She drove home with her heart beating faster than the road conditions warranted. August in Harlan Creek was not kind. The heat was relentless, and it came with a stretch of dry weeks that brought the water in the creek to its lowest point and required Alma to move her cattle to the east pasture where there was still reasonable grass. She was doing this alone on a Thursday morning, managing the herd across the half-mile of open ground, when one of the young bulls decided that the gate at the end of the east pasture was, philosophically, optional. The animal hit the gate at a run before she could redirect him, and the post at the gate's hinged side split cleanly, dropping the gate and opening a section of fence that the rest of the cattle treated immediately as an invitation. Within minutes, she had cattle scattering in 3 directions into open country. She spent 4 hours on horseback, alone in the August heat, gathering them back. By the time the last stray was in, and she had jury-rigged the gate with rope and prayer, she was exhausted in a way that went past bone-deep and approached something close to defeat. She sat on her horse in the hot pasture and looked at her repair, and she thought about her father, who had done this alone too, for years before the sickness took him, and she felt a complicated grief that was also a complicated pride, and she decided that she needed help. Not because she couldn't manage. She could manage. She had proven that across 100 mornings of proving it. But managing alone, when help was available, was not strength. It was stubbornness masquerading as strength, and her father had warned her about that distinction. She drove to the stockyards that Wednesday not for her usual conversation but with a specific purpose. "I need to hire a hand," she told Quinn. "One reliable person part-time 2 or 3 days a week, someone who knows cattle, someone who won't take the job as an invitation to run the operation instead of work it." Quinn looked at her for a moment. "I know someone who might do, fellow named Silas Hoke. He's 22, been working in the yards here for 2 years. Honest worker, knows cattle, no ego. He's looking for more hours. Can I meet him today? He's right over there." Silas Hoke turned out to be a lanky young man with an open, earnest face, and a handshake that was firm without being performed. He had the careful watchfulness of someone who had grown up learning not to assume things, and when Alma interviewed him with the same directness she brought to everything, He answered her question straight and did not try to oversell himself. "I'll pay you fairly," she said. "I'll tell you what needs doing and how I want it done. I'll ask your opinion when I want it and you can offer it when I haven't asked, but you'll understand that the final call is mine. Is that acceptable?" "Yes, ma'am," Silas said. "That's actually more straightforward than most places I've worked." She hired him on the spot. The addition of Silas to the operation changed the rhythm of the ranch considerably. He was reliable and capable, and had a good instinct for cattle that he'd learned mostly by practice and partly from Quinn, who had apparently mentored him in the yards over the past year. With 2 people working, the work that had been running Alma ragged became manageable, and things that had been deferred got done, and the ranch began to feel less like a crisis being contained and more like a place that was actually working. It also meant that Alma had, for the first time since arriving in Harlan Creek, occasional evenings where the work was done and the sun was still above the horizon. She used some of those evenings to do the accounts, and some of them to repair the house further, and some of them, increasingly, to sit on the porch and think about Aaron Quinn. She was aware of the feeling now, and she was examining it with the same careful, practical attention she brought to everything else. It was not the first time she had felt drawn to a man, but it was the first time she had felt drawn to one in a way that had nothing anxious about it. No performance required, no version of herself to present, no sense that the attraction was based on what either of them needed the other to be rather than what they actually were. The problem was that she had no idea what he felt. She had always been better at certainty than uncertainty, and the uncertainty here was a specific kind of discomfort, not quite painful, but insistent, like a stone in her boot that she couldn't decide whether to stop and remove or simply walk through. She asked Silas once, indirectly, or as indirectly as she was capable of being, which was not very, whether Quinn had said anything about her. Silas had been hammering a fence post, and he paused and looked at her with the expression of a young man who has recognized a situation and is deciding how much of his good opinion he wants to spend on it. "Mr. Quinn doesn't say much about people in general," Silas said. "But he asks how the ranch is going. Most every Wednesday when I come in for supplies, he asks how things are out here, and he listens to the answer like it actually matters to him." Alma had turned back to her work and not said anything further, but her heart had done something inconvenient in her chest. September came with a slight easing of the heat and a significant increase in trouble. The trouble came in the form of a man named Dermot Chase, who arrived in Harlan Creek with money and connections, and the stated intention of consolidating land in the area for a large cattle operation. He was 43, prosperous-looking, polished in a way that sat slightly wrong on the Texas dust, and he came to Alma's property on a Tuesday morning with an offer to buy her land. The offer was decent. Not fair, but decent enough that she could live on it for a long time, though not enough to start over at the same scale, and not a price that reflected the true value of the water access. "I'm not selling," Alma said. Chase had the manner of someone who had learned to appear patient while actually being impatient. "Miss Merritt, I understand the sentimental attachment. It's not sentiment, it's arithmetic. The value of this land, including the water rights, is considerably higher than what you've offered, and I have no reason to sell at a number that doesn't reflect what I own. You might find it difficult to hold the ranch alone long-term," Chase said, with the careful neutrality of someone delivering a threat in the form of concern. "I'm not holding it alone. I have staff and I have documentation and I have a herd that is developing well. If you'd like to make a fair offer, I'll consider it. If you'd like to suggest again that running this property is beyond me, you're welcome to leave." Chase left. But he did not leave Harlan Creek, and he had a long conversation with Voss that same afternoon, and the following Wednesday when Alma arrived at the stockyards, the atmosphere was different. Voss was present and watching, and 2 of the regular hands who had always been neutral were suddenly cold, and there was a tension in the yard that she recognized as manufactured. She found Quinn by the horses and said, quietly, What's happened? Chase and Voss are partners, Quinn said, just as quietly. Have been for about a year. There are 3 other properties they've acquired together between here and the county line. Yours is the last piece of the puzzle they need for the water access. How do you know this? I pay attention. He paused. They're going to try to make things difficult for you at the yard, make it hard for you to sell your cattle when they're ready to market. Voss controls who gets access to the buyers he knows. Alma thought about this. Can they actually do it? They can make it harder. Whether they can stop you depends on how many alternatives you can build. What alternatives exist? The Austin buyers who come for the quarterly auction don't go through Voss. The buyer you talk to Perrin, he's independent. If you build that relationship before your herd is ready to sell, you won't need Voss. She looked at him. You've been thinking about this. Something moved behind his eyes. It's been on my mind since the auction. Why? She said it directly, the way she said everything. He was quiet for a moment in the way that meant he was considering exactly what to say. Because I don't think it's right what they're doing, and because he stopped. Because, she pressed, not unkindly but without softening it. Because you matter, he said. And then, before the plainness of that could settle, he added, what you're doing out there matters. It would be wrong to see it damaged. It was not quite the declaration she had been not quite hoping for, but it was the most direct expression of care she had heard from him, and she felt it travel through her whole body like a current. Thank you, she said. She meant it to cover more than what she could say, and she thought he understood that. She wrote a letter to Perrin in Austin that same afternoon and laid the groundwork for a direct sales relationship. She also asked Silas to inquire quietly about other buyers in the county, and she spent an evening going through her father's old correspondence to find the names of cattle dealers her father had dealt with directly. In the meantime, she continued to come to the stockyards every Wednesday, and she and Quinn continued their standing conversations, and the conversations continued to drift toward territories that were less strictly practical. He told her about New Mexico, the landscape of it, the particular quality of light in the evenings over the desert, the way the mountains looked in February. She told him about San Antonio, the life she had left there, the small house near the river, the way her father had read to her on Sunday evenings from whatever book he could find. You loved him very much, Quinn said one Wednesday. Yes, she said. He was difficult and stubborn, and he told me I could do anything, and he meant it completely, and it turned out to be true, and I miss him every single day. Quinn said nothing, but he reached out and briefly covered her hand where it rested on the fence rail, a simple, gentle pressure that lasted only a second, and it was the first time they had touched without the intermediary of emergency or accident, and the warmth of it stayed on her skin long after his hand was gone. October arrived, and with it a development that changed the situation considerably. Chase made a formal legal complaint to the county land office, claiming a boundary dispute on the north section of Alma's property, specifically the creek access that she had fenced in the spring. It was a fabricated dispute, but it was expensive to be wrong about, and it required her to appear before the county judge in Beaumont with her documentation. The trip to Beaumont was 3 days by wagon, too long and too expensive, and too disruptive to her ranch operation to absorb easily. She spent a night going through every document she had, organizing everything into an airtight sequence of evidence, and she arrived back at her kitchen table at midnight feeling the particular specific dread of someone who is completely in the right and still has to prove it to someone with the power to be wrong. She drove to town the next morning to tell Dobbins she would be away for a week and to ask Silas to look after the cattle while she was gone. It was a Thursday, not her usual Wednesday, and she did not expect to see Quinn. He was at the water trough at the end of Main Street, watering his horse, and when he saw her, he read something in her face immediately. What's happened? She told him about the complaint and the hearing. He listened without interrupting, and when she was done he said, I know the land records in the county office. I helped a man from the next county file a similar boundary case 2 years ago. I know exactly what documentation the judge is going to look for first. "You're not a lawyer," she said. "No, but I know what worked and what didn't, and if you'll let me look at what you have, I can tell you if your presentation is in the right order." She looked at him for a moment, weighing pride against practicality, and practicality won, or rather, she realized that practicality and pride were pointing in the same direction, because a woman who refused good help on principle was not being independent, she was being foolish. "Come to dinner tonight," she said. "I'll show you everything I have." He came to dinner. It was the first time he had been to the property since the day he'd helped her drive the cattle out from town, and she noticed that he looked at it differently now than a stranger would, with the particular attention of someone who had been hearing about a place for months and is now seeing whether it matches what they imagined. The house had changed considerably since those early weeks. She had repaired the south wall, painted the porch, added a window box, put proper curtains up inside. The cattle pen was full, and the outbuildings were maintained, and the whole property had the feel of a place that was alive and being cared for. He didn't say anything about it, but she saw it register in his eyes. She had made a proper supper, beef and beans and cornbread and coffee, and they ate at her kitchen table and spread her documents across the other half of it, and he went through them with the careful, organized attention of someone who knew what he was looking for. He suggested she lead with the original survey record, then the deed registration, then the fence installation date, then the water rights document, and he showed her which sections to read aloud and which to have the judge read himself, and how to answer the questions that would be designed to confuse her into a contradictory statement. They worked for 2 hours. At some point the working supper became just sitting at the table after supper, and the documents were to one side, and they were talking about the case, and then about the county, and then about something she could not have traced back to any specific topic. Just talking. The way people talk when they are deeply comfortable with each other, and neither of them wants to be the first to acknowledge that the evening could have ended an hour ago. "Why haven't you left Harlan Creek?" She asked him somewhere near 10 o'clock. "You could find work elsewhere, better pay probably." He was quiet for a moment in the particular way that meant the answer was true and complicated. "This is going to sound strange. Try me. I was going to leave," he said. "About a year ago, had a position in Colorado, good work, good pay, was going to take it." He stopped. "What stopped you?" He looked at her across the table, and the lamplight was warm between them, and he said, "I don't entirely know. The morning I was supposed to leave, I woke up and I didn't go. And every time I've thought about leaving since then, something's kept me here." A pause, shorter than the others. "I think now I know what it was, I just didn't know it then." The words were careful and the meaning was unmistakable, and Alma's heart was very loud in the quiet of the kitchen. "Aaron," she said. "Alma," he said at exactly the same time. They both stopped. She laughed, a real one, sudden and full, the kind that startled her. And he laughed too, and the tension broke and reformed into something lighter and more alive, and he leaned forward on the table and said, "Can I say something plain? I wish you would. I think about you every day," he said. "I have since approximately the 3rd time we talked. I've been trying not to say anything because I know you have a ranch to run and a case to fight and a reputation to build in this town, and I didn't want you to think I was trying to complicate that." "You have not complicated it," she said. "You have in fact been the least complicated thing about this year." Something in him shifted, a release of something he had been holding carefully. "I'm glad," he said. "I think about you too," she said, "in case that wasn't clear." "It wasn't," he said. "But I'm glad it is now." They sat across from each other in the warm light, and neither of them reached across the table, because some things deserve to unfold gradually, and this was one of them. But the air between them had changed into something that would not change back, and when he left an hour later and she watched him ride down the dark road from the porch, she felt the rightness of it settle into her like warmth after cold, gradual, complete, absolute. She won a Beaumont, and she won the case. The judge took 30 minutes with her documentation and told Chase's lawyer that the complaint was without merit and dismissed it with costs against Chase. Alma rode back to Harlan Creek in a wagon that was lighter than the one that had left. though nothing material had changed except her certainty about the future. She found Quinn at the stockyards when she returned, and when she told him the outcome, his expression did something uncomplicated and open that she had not seen before on his usually guarded face. "I knew it," he said. "I had good advice," she said. "You had good documentation," he corrected. "The advice was minor. The advice was not minor." They looked at each other, and the professional context of the stockyards and the gate between them and the other men moving through the yard felt suddenly very inadequate as a container for what was happening between them, and he said, "Will you ride with me Sunday? Out toward the plateau. I know a section of the creek where it's decent country." "Yes," she said without hesitation. "I'd like that." Sunday morning arrived and he came to the property on his quarter-horse mare, the stubborn one, the fast one, who turned out to be a beautiful animal now that she was better trained, dark red with a bright black mane and an eye that assessed everything sharply. He brought her a small bunch of wildflowers, which he offered without ceremony or performance, just holding them out when she came off the porch. And she took them and looked at them for a moment and put them in water inside and came back out, and they rode without speaking until they were past the north fence and into open country. The Edwards Plateau in October was extraordinary, the grass going golden, the sky a deep, hard blue, the air carrying the first real edge of autumn in the evenings. They rode along the creek to the flat shelf of limestone that jutted out over a deep bend in the water, and they stopped there and sat on the rock and looked at the country spread out below them, and they talked all afternoon. He told her things he had not told her before, about his mother, who had died 3 years ago, 2 years after his father, and about the particular loneliness of being the last member of your family to know your parents, even though he had a sister and brothers. She told him about the year after her mother died when she had been 9, and how her father had been lost for 2 months and then had come back to himself and made her pancakes and said, "We're going to be all right and I'm going to make sure of it." "Were you?" Quinn asked. "We were," she said. "He kept his word." The sun moved across the sky and the light went amber and then red, and neither of them suggested leaving. When the first star appeared above the plateau edge and the air turned cool, she shivered once without meaning to, and he took his jacket off and put it across her shoulders with the unhurried ease of a man who has thought about doing this for a long time and is finally getting to. She looked at him. He was right there, beside her on the limestone shelf, close enough that the warmth of him was present in the cooling air. "Quinn," she said. "Alma," he said. And this time nobody laughed, because there was nothing light about it. There was just the two of them in the evening air above the creek, and he put his hand against her face, gentle and sure, and she leaned into it. And then he kissed her, slow and careful and completely meant, and she kissed him back with everything she was, and it was the most natural thing that had happened since she had arrived in this town, as natural as the creek running and the grass growing and the light coming over the plateau in the mornings. November was beautiful. Alma Merritt and Aaron Quinn were not a secret. They were not trying to be a secret, and in a town the size of Harlan Creek there was no such thing anyway. Dobbins knew within a week, because Dobbins knew everything, and he told Alma with visible satisfaction that he was very pleased about it. Silas Hoke said nothing but grinned for 2 solid days. Voss's response was predictable and petty. He told several people around town that Quinn had lost his head over a woman who would drag him down with her when the ranch failed, and those several people told Alma or Quinn, as people in small towns tend to, and both of them found it equally untroubling. The ranch was not going to fail. That had become, in the previous months, not a hope but a fact. Quinn began spending his days off at the ranch, which rapidly became most of his time because the stockyards reduced his hours. Whether at Voss's direction or through legitimate schedule changes was unclear and ultimately irrelevant. He used the time to help with the work that Silas could not cover alone, and he did it in the way he did everything practically, without fuss, always under Alma's direction, and without the slightest suggestion that he thought his presence changed the terms of her ownership. This last thing she noticed, and it meant more to her than she said. One evening in early November, when they had finished repairing the loading chute and were washing up at the pump and the sky was going purple over the plateau, she said, "You never try to tell me what to do." He was rolling down his sleeve. "Nope. Most men try to tell me what to do." I noticed. He glanced at her. "You know your business, I know mine. When I know something useful, I say it. When I don't, I don't." "It's unusual," she said. "Is it?" He seemed genuinely curious. "Yes." She leaned against the pump post. "In my experience, men have a very hard time with women who are competent in their domain. They tend to feel either threatened or condescending, and both of those are exhausting." He was quiet for a moment, looking at the sky. "My mother ran our household and the accounts and most of the practical decisions when we were young," he said. "My father was good with horses and better with people, but he was not an organized man. She was. He respected it completely. I grew up thinking that was just how it worked." A pause. "I was surprised when I got older to find out it wasn't." She looked at him in the purple evening light and felt a tenderness for him that she didn't quite have words for, something that was part affection and part recognition and part the specific relief of understanding where someone comes from. "Your mother sounds remarkable," she said. "She was. You would have liked each other." The certainty in his voice made her throat go tight. "Aaron," she said, and he turned to look at her and she said, "I love you." She said it the way she did things, directly, without ceremony, without building up to it, because she had decided it was true, and she saw no reason to withhold it once decided. He looked at her for one long moment, and then he crossed the space between them and held her face in his hands and said, "I love you, Alma. I have loved you since the first time you told Voss what the actual price of his cattle was." She laughed, and he kissed her forehead, and they stood there in the November evening with the cattle moving quietly in the pen, and the stars beginning to come out over the plateau, and everything felt, for the first time in a long time, not like a battle or a project, but simply like her life, full and warm and genuinely hers. Chase made one final move in December. It was more sophisticated than his previous attempts and more genuinely threatening. He had found a technicality in the original land survey, a section of the water rights documentation from the 1860s, where the language was ambiguous enough to be legally challenged, and he had filed a new complaint that argued the water rights had never been formally transferred with the deed, and therefore remained with the previous owner, who had sold to Thomas Merritt's predecessor without clearly recording them. It was, in short, a well-crafted piece of legal trouble. Alma sat with it for 2 days, and then she did what she had learned to do. She gathered every piece of relevant information. She consulted the people whose knowledge she needed, and she formulated a plan. The person whose knowledge she needed was a lawyer in Austin, a man named Hargrove who had been recommended by Perrin, the cattle buyer. The cost of his services was significant relative to her current margins, and engaging him meant deferring several ranch improvements she had planned. But the alternative was losing the water rights, which would effectively end the ranch's viability, and that was not an alternative. Quinn drove her to Austin. It was a 3-day trip, and they stayed at a boarding house on opposite ends of the hallway, because they were not yet married, and Alma was not interested in being the subject of gossip on that particular front when she had enough else to manage, and Quinn understood this entirely. They spent the evenings after supper in the boarding house sitting room, working through the legal strategy with Hargrove's notes and talking about everything that was not legal strategy, what they wanted the ranch to look like in 5 years, in 10 years, what they each wanted from a life that was not just surviving but actually living. He told her he wanted a life with her. He said it quietly, sitting across a small table with a lamp between them, looking at her with the clear, steady attention that she had come to know was his way of saying something that mattered. "I know we haven't talked about specifics," he said, "and I'm not pushing for anything before you're ready, but I want you to know that's what I want." "I want it too," she said. "The specifics are just details." He smiled, the full version, the one she had been accumulating in her memory all year. Then we'll work out the details. Hargrove proved to be excellent. He found a legal precedent in two similar water rights cases from the 1870s that effectively dismantled Chase's argument, and he filed a counter-complaint that put the burden of proof on Chase for the initial survey ambiguity. The process took 2 months of waiting, and continuing to work the ranch, and continuing to build the relationship with Perrin and the other buyers, and continuing to be present and visible and functional in Harlan Creek. Chase settled in February of 1879, dropping the complaint entirely and paying Hargrove's fees as part of the settlement. It was a complete and unambiguous victory, and Alma received the news on a Thursday morning at her kitchen table and sat very still for a long moment, and then allowed herself, alone in her kitchen, to cry, not from sadness but from the release of 8 months of sustained, focused, unrelenting effort, the way a muscle releases when the weight is finally set down. She heard hooves in the yard 20 minutes later and found Quinn dismounting at the fence. He had heard in-town news traveled fast in Harlan Creek, and he had come directly. He opened the gate and walked up to the porch where she was standing and looked at her face, which was still visibly the face of a woman who had recently been crying. He did not ask if she was all right. He walked up the porch steps and folded her into his arms, and she put her head against his chest and listened to his heart beating, and they stood there for a long time with the February sun warm on their backs and the cattle moving in the pen and the creek running in the distance. "It's done," she said. "It's done," he agreed. "He's not coming back. He's not coming back." "Good," she said, and then, muffled against his shirt, "I want to marry you." He pulled back enough to look at her face. "Are you asking me? I'm stating a preference." He was smiling now, wide and genuine and entirely unguarded. "Then my answer to your stated preference is yes. Absolutely, completely yes." She laughed. He kissed her in the February sunlight on the porch of the house her father had left her, and it was very good. They were married in March of 1879 in the Harlan Creek courthouse. Not because a church ceremony would not have been nice, but because neither of them had strong ties to a particular congregation, and the practical simplicity of the courthouse suited both their personalities. Dobbins attended and brought his wife, who cried happy tears throughout. Silas Hoke stood with them as a witness and wore a clean shirt and looked very proud of himself for no specific reason. The judge who performed the ceremony was the same judge who had ruled in Alma's boundary case in the autumn, and he looked at her with the particular approval of a man who respects a well-presented argument. Alma wore a dress of soft green wool that she had sewn herself over the winter, and she wore her father's hat to the courthouse door and then left it inside when they went in, because Thomas Merritt had wanted her to stand on her own feet, and she was doing that, and the hat could wait for her. Quinn wore his best jacket and had shaved, and he looked at Alma when she came through the door with the expression of a man who cannot believe his good fortune and is nonetheless absolutely certain it's real. The ceremony was brief, and the words were direct, and when the judge pronounced them married, Quinn took her face in his hands the way he always did when something mattered, and he kissed her in front of the small crowd, and Dobbins' wife said something that was either a prayer of thanks or a very enthusiastic yes. They rode back to the ranch together, husband and wife in the spring light, and the cattle were in the pen and the creek was running high with the early rains, and the grass was coming in green after the winter, and Alma looked at all of it, the house, the outbuildings, the fence lines, the herd, and felt the particular deep satisfaction of a thing that is exactly what it is supposed to be. That first summer as a married couple was the best working season the ranch had yet seen. Alma's herd had grown to 32 head, enough to begin selling the surplus at the summer auction, and the sale went well. Perrin brought 2 other Austin buyers, and the prices were strong, and for the first time the ranch turned a genuine profit rather than just breaking even. Quinn had left the stockyards formally and was working the ranch full-time, and Silas Hoke stayed on as their primary hand, now with a small wage increase that the better margins allowed. Voss made one more appearance in their lives that summer, a small, petty attempt to contest Alma's access to the auction grounds, and Quinn handled it so quietly and efficiently, through a brief and evidently decisive conversation with the auction organizer, that Alma didn't hear about it until 2 days later. "What did you say to him?" she asked. Quinn thought about it. "I told him that he should direct any future concerns about the Merritt Quinn ranch to our lawyer, and that our lawyer's name was Hargrove in Austin, and that Hargrove was the same man who had handled the settlement against Chase, and that Hargrove was very good at his job." Alma looked at him. "That was all." "That was all. He left. She shook her head slowly. "I've been fighting that man for a year and a half." "You were fighting him alone," Quinn said. "It's different." And then, because he could tell by her expression that this might land wrong, he added, "Not because you couldn't handle it, but because men like Voss are cowards, and cowards are more afraid of opposition they can't dismiss." He could tell himself a story about dismissing a woman on her own. He couldn't tell himself the same story after. She thought about this. "That's an honest reading of it." "It's an honest world," he said. "Some parts of it are unjust, and those parts should be changed. The fact that you had to fight harder than a man would have had to fight is wrong. It's also true." She loved him, she thought, for saying that so plainly, for not pretending the injustice wasn't real, and not pretending either that it defined her. "It was also worth it," she said. "Every bit of it." "Yes," he agreed. "It was." Autumn of 1879 brought the sweetest change yet. Alma realized in October that she was expecting, and she sat with the news for 2 days before telling Quinn, not from uncertainty about him, but from the particular private relationship between a woman and the knowledge of a life she is carrying, a relationship that required a short period of being alone with it before being shared. She told him on a Sunday evening, sitting on the porch at sunset. She simply said, "We're going to have a baby." He went very still for a moment, the way he went still when something significant was landing. Then he looked at her with an expression that was entirely different from any she had seen on him before, open and full and somewhere between joy and reverence. "Alma," he said. "In the spring," she said. "Around April, I think." He moved to sit beside her and took her hand and held it, and they sat watching the sunset over the plateau, and he did not say anything grand or excessive, but he kept her hand in both of his, and she could feel the warmth of it down to the bone. The pregnancy was straightforward. She was healthy and strong, and she continued working through the winter, adapting her activities as practical necessity required and not before. Quinn was quietly attentive in the way he was quiet about everything, present without hovering, helpful without taking over, watching her carefully enough to anticipate needs she hadn't articulated without making her feel managed. Silas Hoke was informed in November and spent approximately 48 hours in a state of visible emotional crisis before settling into a proud, protective manner that made Alma feel like she had accidentally acquired a second brother. Their son was born in April of 1880, a clear, cold morning that came in on the heels of a late frost and broke by noon into the most perfect spring day the plateau had produced in years. He arrived with a full voice and a strong pair of lungs, and a dark thatch of hair that was entirely his mother's. And Quinn held him for the first time standing in the bedroom doorway, with the morning light coming in behind him. And his expression was the kind of thing that cannot be described, except to say that it was the expression of a man who has been given something so important that he is briefly unable to contain it. They named him Thomas Aaron Quinn, Thomas for Alma's father and Aaron for his own, since Quinn's father had also been named Aaron, which Alma had not known until she asked what name meant something to him, and he had said, "My father was Aaron too," and she had said, "Then that's decided." Thomas Quinn was, from the beginning, a decided personality, loud in his opinions, charming in his manner, and possessed of his mother's ability to look directly at a thing and evaluate it without sentiment. He also had his father's patience, which balanced the directness considerably. The ranch expanded in 1880 and again in 1881. Alma's direct cattle sales to Austin buyers became a regular and profitable channel, fully independent of the local stockyard, which meant that Voss was never able to leverage his yard's access against them again. Two additional properties adjacent to the Merritt Ranch came up for sale over those 2 years, and Alma and Quinn purchased the smaller 180 acres, good grassland, creek frontage, which pushed the total property to over 500 acres and significantly expanded the herd's carrying capacity. Chase had left Harlan Creek by late 1879, his local consolidation project having failed completely, and his partnership with Voss having dissolved under the financial pressure of the legal costs. Voss remained, diminished, and eventually retired to a house on the edge of town that was smaller than what he had come to think of as his due. Neither of them came to represent anything larger than what they were, opportunistic men who had encountered someone more capable and more stubborn than they had expected, and had failed, and had had to live with that. Harlan Creek itself grew through those years, new families arriving, a proper school being established, the church getting a new building, the saloon at the Red Mare changing hands and improving its coffee. Dobbin's dry goods store expanded and took on a part-time assistant. The quarterly cattle auction became an important regional event. Alma became one of the most respected ranching voices in the county, not because she had campaigned for respect, but because she had earned it across a sustained period of visible, documented, successful work, and the county had eventually caught up to that fact. In 1882, a delegation of the town's ranchers asked her to serve on the county's newly formed Cattle Association Board. She accepted, because it was useful and she had views worth contributing, and she ran the board meetings with the same direct, specific efficiency she brought to everything, and the association was considerably more functional than it had been in its first year. Quinn served as the association's treasurer because he was meticulous with numbers, and because Alma had strongly suggested it, and his wife's strong suggestions had a very good track record. Their daughter was born in 1882, 2 years after Thomas, another April child, another clear morning, another dark-haired baby with a loud opinion about being new to the world. They named her Clara after Quinn's mother, and she was from her first weeks a person of profound focus and great warmth, sitting quietly in whatever room was busiest and watching everything with enormous dark eyes. She had her father's steadiness and her mother's perceptiveness, and the combination was, everyone agreed, going to be formidable. Thomas Quinn, aged 2, regarded his new sister with the expression of a person who had been given information he was still processing, and then brought her a piece of cornbread wrapped in his shirt pocket and laid it carefully beside her in the cradle, because he had understood from the adults around him that babies needed things, and cornbread was the best thing he could personally supply. Alma, watching this from across the room, had to turn away to manage her expression. The spring of 1883 found the Merritt Quinn Ranch at its most settled, and its most alive, 540 acres with a healthy breeding herd, good fences, a renovated house that had lost all traces of the disrepair of 1878, and become a genuinely fine home with a wide porch and good windows, and a kitchen large enough for the family that lived in it. Silas Hoke was still there, now 27, and had taken on 2 additional hands to help with the expanded operation. He had also, over the winter, begun a quiet courtship of the schoolteacher's daughter, which the whole town was following with the deep investment of people who have run out of fresh news. Alma stood at the fence of the cattle pen on a May morning in 1883 and looked out at her herd, 53 head now, well-managed, productive, the result of 5 years of careful work and good decisions, and the willingness to learn and adapt and fight when fighting was required. Thomas was inside with Clara, engaged in a game that involved considerable amounts of flour on the kitchen floor. Quinn was in the near pasture checking the fence line, his quarter-horse mare, older now but still bright-eyed, moving patiently alongside him. She thought about the woman who had climbed down from a livery wagon in 1878 with a deed in her hand and a town full of skeptics, and she thought about everything that had been won since then, not just the legal battles and the business victories, though those had mattered enormously, but the smaller, more personal things. The conversations at the stockyard fence, the October ride to the plateau, the evenings at the kitchen table with documents and coffee, and then, gradually, with nothing but each other's company as the main attraction. Quinn saw her at the fence from the pasture and rode toward her, and when he reached the gate he leaned down from the saddle to look at her with that specific warm attention that was still, after 5 years, as good as the first time. "Thinking hard about something," he said. It was not a question. "Thinking about all of it," she said. "From the beginning." He swung down from the mare and came to stand beside her at the fence, both of them looking out at the herd in the morning light. His hand found hers on the rail the way it always did, unhurried, sure and there. "What's the conclusion?" he asked. She thought about the word for it. The conclusion. The thing at the end of the calculation after all the variables. "I would do every single bit of it again," she said. "Every argument, every fence post, every legal filing, every mile of road to Austin." She paused. "And I would still walk into that cattle pen to prove the point." He laughed low and genuine and warm. "And I would still stand where you could reach me." She turned to look at him. This man she had chosen and who had chosen her, who had never once asked her to be smaller than she was, who had stood beside her in every sense of the phrase without ever standing in front of her. The morning light was good on his face and on the grass and on the water of the creek in the distance, and Thomas was probably making an enormous mess in the kitchen and Clara was probably helping him with it, and the cattle were moving in the pen with the particular contentment of well-fed animals in good pasture, and the sky above the Edwards Plateau was the deep, hard blue of a Texas May. "I love you, Aaron Quinn," she said. "I love you, Alma Quinn," he said, and the name was still new enough to be a pleasure and familiar enough to be a certainty, and he kissed her at the fence in the morning sun the way he had kissed her 100 times, as if it was both the first time and exactly what was supposed to happen. The cattle moved in the pen. The creek ran on. The Merritt Quinn ranch stood whole and working and entirely, completely theirs. And life, which had been for so long a thing Alma had needed to fight for with both hands, became the most natural thing in the world, full and warm and stubbornly, beautifully alive.